So here's one way that you could maybe try to motivate the reverse premise, like that possibly God does not exist.
Right.
Some people have wanted to say that God's existence is impossible because his attributes are contradictory.
Right.
Maybe there's like two attributes he has, like perfect mercy and perfect justice. These two attributes seem to contradict each other like directly. And maybe we don't have to focus on those two, but what's your take on that? Like, how do you resolve that kind of?
Okay, so I want to expand the question because Yujin Nagasawa's recent work on this, now published with Oxford, called Maximal God, addresses these kinds of questions. And Yujin thinks that there are three different kinds of arguments against the existence of a maximally great being. One kind of argument purports to show the inconsistency or the self-referential incoherence of any like single great-making attribute.
And I'm thinking more like when you mention married bachelor, sort of the same lines?
Slightly, but different. So let's consider omnipotence, right?
Okay.
The idea that God is all-powerful, that God can do just anything, right? Well, if God is all-powerful, then he can create a rock that's so heavy that not even God could lift it. I mean, if he can't do that, then there's something that God can't do. But if he can do it, if he can create a rock that's so heavy that not even God can lift it, well, then once he creates the rock, well, now there's something that God can't do. So no matter how you think through the puzzle, it looks like God can't really be omnipotent. So that's one kind of argument against the idea that there even could be a maximally great being. I think there's responses to the paradox of the stone. But that's just one of the kind of arguments. Now, the second kind of argument that Yujin gives is what you're talking about. And he says, so an omnibenevolent being, a morally perfect being, well, that being can't sin. But an omnipotent being is all-powerful. Like, clearly it's possible to sin. So it sure seems like you couldn't have a being that is simultaneously morally perfect and all-powerful. And then there's a third kind of argument that says, hey, look, you know, one or more of these great-making attributes is incompatible with some contingent fact about the universe. So the problem of evil is sort of the paradigmatic example of this kind of argument. If God is all good and God is all powerful, then why is there so much evil in the world? Well, Yujin's response to all this is that rather than respond to each and every version of some anti-theistic argument, let's take a more economic approach and just say, God is whatever the greatest conceivable being is. So maybe omnipotence and omnibenevolence are incompatible. I mean, I'm not saying that they are incompatible, but maybe they are. Fine. So do the trade-off, and whatever is better to be than not be, that's all I need in order to get my ontological argument to run through. Because something's at the top of the food chain. Something actually is the greatest possible being. And it's silly to think there couldn't be something that's at the top of the food chain because there's some other thing that's even higher than that that's not logically possible at all. That doesn't give us a good reason to think that there is no God. It rather gives us a good reason if any of those arguments are successful, and I don't think they are, but if any of those arguments were successful, it gives us a good reason not to think that God doesn't exist, but rather that the God who does exist is not that kind of God. It's some other kind of God. God has this nature, not that nature. Now, I have worries about this kind of economic modification, and I have a paper that's under review right now that raises some concerns about what the modifications might lead to. But I think Yujin is right that arguments that purport to show the incompatibility of multiple attributes don't establish that God does not exist. It rather just establishes that God might be a little bit different than we think he is.
Very interesting.